I went to a romantic dinner with my wife, in a dimly lit restaurant, the kind of place she always said she loved, where the wine came in oversized glasses and the waiter called even those who didn't deserve the title, sir. I was there, facing the woman I'd shared more than a decade of my life with, believing that dinner was an attempt at reconnection, a breather after so many heavy routines and long silences. She was wearing the dress she saved for special occasions, the same perfume she'd chosen on our wedding day, and she was smiling. It was a light smile, but now I understand that smile wasn't meant for me. It was a guilty smile. Of someone about to break free, not reconnect. In the middle of a conversation about nothing, because that's what couples do when they try to postpone the inevitable, a strange man approached our table. The kind of man who doesn't ask permission. Who takes. He looked at me and then at her, as if I were the intruder. And then he extended his hand, not to me, but to her. And she held on. I rose from my chair, my heart racing as if something inside me already knew what was going to happen, but I still asked, because the mind always tries to deny the obvious, "What are you doing?" And his answer was the coldest blade I'd ever felt pierced my chest, "That woman is going home with me. She's been dating me for a long time." I looked at her, expecting a reaction, a denial, a look of help, anything that would tell me this was a misunderstanding, a delusional nightmare. But she just stared at me. And in her eyes, there was no longer surprise, no regret. There was only truth. Silent. Cruel. A truth that explained every poorly made excuse, every night she preferred the guest room, every meaningless "I'm tired." There, before me, she fell apart. The woman I'd loved for years, the one who'd promised loyalty, left with someone else as if she'd never belonged to me. I stood there, watching them leave, as if I were an extra in my own story. The people around me whispered, but everything was a distant hum, because inside me there was only noise. The sound of my life falling apart. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just decided. I decided it was time to leave, not just that city, but everything it represented. I moved to a place where no one knew my story, where her name didn't weigh on my shoulders, where the memories still hadn't taken root. And there, surprisingly, I found a new love. Someone who looked at me as if I were still worth it, as if I could still be whole. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Not like before, but in a new way, perhaps more real. I rebuilt myself. Slowly, day by day. And when I finally began to believe that all of that was behind me, when the pain had become just scars, someone knocked on my door. I opened it. And there she was. The same woman who destroyed me. But different. Her eyes were tired, her face pale, her hands trembling. She didn't smile. She just said, "I still love you." And before I could say anything, she continued, "I want to try again. Please." I was silent for long seconds, because part of me wanted to understand how someone could want to come back after destroying everything. But the other, stronger part of me already knew the answer. I wasn't that man anymore. I had moved on. And no matter how much the past tried to pull me back, I knew there was no longer room for her in my life. So, calmly, I said, "I forgive you. But I don't love you anymore." And there, in that moment, I saw her world crumble. Not out of anger, nor revenge. But because of the coldness of reality. She realized she had lost the most precious thing she had, someone who truly loved her. Since then, she's tried everything. Messages. Unexpected visits. Flowers. Letters. And it was one of those letters that left a lasting impression on me. It arrived on an ordinary morning, in a white envelope, with no return address. I opened it out of curiosity. It was a handwritten letter from her, in shaky handwriting. She spoke of our past, of the mistakes she'd made, of the nights she'd cried, hugging pillows, and how her lover, the same one who'd taken her away from my table, abandoned her months later. She said she'd walked the streets waiting to see me, that she dreamed of my smile, and that she blamed herself for every silence I'd made. But it was the end of the letter that hit me hard. She wrote, "Today I found that box you kept in the back of your closet. Inside were our photos, an old ring, and a letter from you, written years ago. In it, you said, 'I promise to love you until the end, as long as you want to stay.'" I cried for hours. Because I realized the end had come, the day I chose to leave. And there, reading it, I realized that, for the first time, she truly understood. She understood what she'd lost. She understood that love isn't something you throw away hoping to find something better. And she understood, most importantly, that some doors, once closed, never open again. Today, each of us lives with our choices. She with regret. I with peace. But there's something she doesn't know, something that's been kept in that same closet for many years. A single answer I never revealed, not even in the final letter. And it's this answer that, if she ever learns, will completely change what she believes to have been the truth. Because there's something in that letter, something that was never said. And you might wonder, what was so important about the letter she found? What had her husband written so many years before that could turn everything upside down? This will only be revealed at the end. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. The stories you will hear are completely fictitious, but they portray with intensity and realism how infidelity destroys lives, corrodes relationships, and leaves deep scars. Our purpose is clear: show that cheating is never worth it. Get ready. You're about to hear a story shocking, full of twists and turns, and with a lesson you will never forget. Press play, and enjoy the story. Ethan and Helena were the kind of couple who effortlessly commanded attention. There was something about them that seemed rooted, a solid connection that had withstood many of life's natural tests. They married young, when certainties came more from the heart than from logic. Ethan, with a calm demeanor and a low voice, was an architect. From an early age, he demonstrated an obsession with details, both in projects and in relationships. Helena, on the other hand, was restless, intense, the kind of person who embraces the world with the same intensity with which she retreats to process silence. She taught literature at a private school, and her gaze always seemed to conceal a sea of thoughts that didn't easily overflow. Together, they formed a seemingly harmonious duo. He built structures, she filled the voids. The first years of their marriage were marked by discovery and complicity. The house they lived in had been designed by Ethan, a two-story house with large windows, off-white walls, and a lavender garden that Helena tended with an almost therapeutic dedication. Their bedroom had a shelf filled with books chosen by her, and a weathered leather armchair where he liked to sit after work, often with a glass of wine in hand, while she read aloud passages from authors the world had forgotten. To outsiders, they were the perfect balance of reason and emotion. But, like any relationship that transcends the initial enchantment, they began to experience what only time reveals: the microfractures, the silences that linger, the automatic gestures, the silent dinners where the sound of cutlery betrays more than any argument. Ethan was devoted to his profession. Not out of obsession, but out of identity. The projects he signed placed him among the most sought after in the region, and this generated a certain pride in Helena, but also a silent unease. She never said it outright, but she sensed that at some point, he began to love what he built outside more than what they had built together. Still, she was grateful for his integrity, predictability, and trustworthiness, qualities she often said she admired, but which, on deeper nights, she wondered if they still touched her as they once did. Helena was also admired. She had a spontaneous elegance, the kind of beauty that doesn't scream. When she entered a room, people's eyes were drawn not only to her appearance, but also to the way she held herself, firm yet gentle. Her rapport with her students was admirable, and many parents said they wished they'd had a teacher like her when they were younger. This filled her with pride, even though deep down she carried a certain emptiness that was hard to name. It was as if the intensity she offered to the world didn't resonate with her at home. Ethan heard her, but sometimes he didn't. And she noticed, even when he smiled automatically as he glanced at his phone or a draft of a project. Despite this, they had a stable, financially secure, and socially admired life. The annual trips, the Saturday dinners with friends, the Sunday breakfast ritual, everything followed a functional and peaceful schedule. But somewhere along the line, the tranquility began to feel monotonous to Helena, and the predictability, suffocating. Ethan, for his part, saw no problem. He was convinced this was the natural course of mature relationships, and he felt comfortable in this stability. When she said she missed something more, he tried to compensate with gifts or plans for the future. But he never really asked what that something more was. There was a growing sense of disconnect, but not dramatic enough to be a crisis. It was like a silk thread slowly breaking. Ethan noticed small changes, the way she took longer in the shower, the way she started sleeping facing away from him, the way her eyes lingered longer at the windows. He tried to strike up a conversation, propose dinners for two, revive traditions, but he wasn't always receptive. Still, he never doubted her loyalty. Not out of naivete, but out of faith. For him, love was a solid pact, forged in small gestures and words that stood the test of time. Helena, despite her worries, never considered hurting him. At least, not consciously. She respected him, admired him, perhaps even loved him, but it was like loving an old photograph. Something you value for what it once represented, not for what still pulsates. She had internal crises, doubts she didn't share with anyone. She knew that, from the outside, her life seemed perfect, and this only increased her guilt for not feeling fulfilled. She had everything many people sought, and yet, something inside her was missing. She spent hours walking the school hallways, looking at the walls with old paintings, trying to understand what had been lost. One day, in one of those empty downtown cafes, she began writing in an old notebook she found at the bottom of a drawer. She wrote letters to herself. Letters where she said what she didn't have the courage to say out loud. About how invisible she sometimes felt, even when noticed. About how her body yearned to feel something new, even when she was beside a man who never stopped being respectful. The words flowed as if they had been trapped for years. They weren't letters of anger. They were silent outbursts, attempts to understand why a woman who had so much felt so empty inside. Ethan, on the other hand, kept trying. He bought tickets for a romantic getaway, made reservations at places she said she liked, wrote notes with phrases he himself considered corny but believed were valuable. Sometimes she responded with a smile, but not with enthusiasm. Other times, she simply thanked him silently. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing, but at least he was trying. The thought of losing her was unthinkable. Because more than a wife, she was part of his story. She was the home he had built with his own hands. And losing that would be like watching a house slowly crumble, without knowing where the crack began. There was love between them, yes. But love is sometimes a tree that grows crooked when not pruned with truth. Helena felt guilty for the doubts she carried. Ethan felt frustrated by his failed attempts at reconnection. They were together, but emotionally distant. And yet, there were nights when she would rest her head on his chest, seeking a shelter she didn't even know still existed. And there were mornings when he would make her coffee exactly how she liked it, as if he still believed that gesture was enough to keep her there. The house remained silent, but alive. The days passed with a certain harmony. Nothing screamed, nothing exploded. But deep down, there was an invisible tension, as if something were about to be revealed. They weren't talking about it, but they both knew. And that's what made everything even more delicate. The love endured, but tired. The admiration remained, but muffled. And between them, there was a space. A space that hadn't existed at first, but now grew like a shadow neither wanted to name. Until one day, something changed. Small, almost imperceptible. But enough to alter the silent rhythm of their relationship. A gesture, an absence, a look that lingered longer than it should have. And although neither of them commented, the heart of one of them already knew. Knew the pieces of the puzzle were about to shift. That the story they had written together was about to be interrupted by a painful comma. But in that moment, there was still silence. There was still a blooming lavender garden, a sofa worn from routine, a pair of cups waiting for afternoon coffee. There was still an us. But for how much longer? The seasons changed gently that year, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. Ethan and Helena continued with their routines, but now the tension that had previously been just a thin line in the air had become thicker, more present, like a second air forcing them to breathe differently. Ethan increasingly realized that something in his home had changed, not in the furniture, not in the walls, but in the spaces between gestures. Helen had become more distant, yet present. She responded gently, but without warmth. She touched his hand out of habit, not desire. He tried to pretend it was just fatigue, but deep down, something screamed silently. It wasn't easy to accept that the love that sustained his life might be seeping through the edges of his routine. Still, he tried. He planned a trip for two to the coast, remembered the restaurant where they'd first met, bought tickets to a place she'd mentioned months before. All to no avail. She responded politely, but not enthusiastically. Her eyes no longer sparkled as they once had. And even though it hurt, he kept telling himself it was just a phase. Helena, on the other hand, felt trapped in a consuming duality. She knew what a good man Ethan was. A faithful, honest, and kind companion. But deep inside, something had broken almost invisibly. A chasm between who she was and who she pretended to be grew wider with each passing day. Nights with Ethan no longer brought comfort. His touch, once familiar and safe, now felt strange, like a distant echo of something that had once been whole. And even though she didn't want to hurt him, she began keeping secrets. Small ones at first, an unspoken encounter, a deleted message, a new perfume worn only when she was alone. The guilt was constant, but it was mixed with a kind of freedom she hadn't felt in years. It was like taking a deep breath after holding it for too long. She wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't looking for pain. But she had allowed herself to feel again. And that was impossible to deny. It all began with an unexpected reunion. An old colleague, the kind that time never completely erases. A familiar look, a conversation that flowed naturally, a touch of irony in the comments that made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in a long time. He listened to her, not just heard. He asked about her fears, her forgotten dreams, her hidden frustrations. He didn't judge, he didn't correct. He simply welcomed her. And, for the first time in years, she felt seen. It disturbed her. She returned home that night with a turmoil in her chest, staring at Ethan sleeping, breathing lightly, his face serene, completely oblivious to the storm brewing beside him. She thought about telling him. She thought about crying. But she preferred silence. She thought it would pass. That it was just a memory too good for the present. But it didn't. The encounters repeated themselves. First casual, then planned. What began as conversation evolved into subtle touches, long glances, hands seeking each other without permission. And then, inevitably, the boundary was broken. She betrayed him. Not just with her body, but with her soul. She went into the arms of another man while her husband trusted her without question. The betrayal didn't happen in a cinematic fashion. It was silent, in a discreet hotel, in a nondescript room with white sheets and a window overlooking nothingness. But inside her, it was like an earthquake. She felt guilt, yes. But he also felt a pleasure he hadn't experienced in years. The kind of pleasure that isn't limited to the flesh, but comes from the feeling of still being desired, of still awakening something in someone. She returned home feeling lighter, and it terrified her. Ethan, as always, greeted her with a kiss on the forehead and a shy smile. He asked if she was okay. She said yes, and they both went to sleep. But that night wasn't like the others. For the first time, she cried silently beside him, facing the wall, knowing she had crossed a line from which she could never return. From that moment on, her life divided into before and after. In the following days, she tried to act normally. But the body doesn't lie. The eyes don't hide it. Ethan, albeit unconsciously, began to notice. And it wasn't just a suspicion. It was a feeling that grew with each passing hour. He began to notice the details. Her cell phone face down, the way she took so long to respond to messages, the way she sometimes smiled to herself. He began to form hypotheses, then discard them. And then it all started again. One ordinary night, he decided to prepare a special dinner. He cooked her favorite dish and set the table with candles that had been stored away for months. When she arrived, she was surprised, but smiled. She sat at the table, ate in silence, and said it was delicious. But he didn't ask why. He expected a deeper reaction. A gesture, a tear, an apology that didn't yet make sense but might reveal something. Nothing came. Only silence and gratitude. After dinner, she went to the bathroom. He stayed in the kitchen, washing the dishes, looking out the window. And it was there that he felt, with an undeniable force, that the woman in the room was no longer his. The following days were marked by denser silences. Ethan began leaving earlier, returning later. He worked more intensely, but what he sought wasn't occupation, it was numbness. Helena, on the other hand, felt increasingly torn. Her lover began to want more. More meetings, more messages, more of her. But she couldn't offer everything. There were still bonds. Bonds that, even frayed, still held. And it was then that she began to lose herself. Between two worlds, two men, two distinct desires. And the more involved she became, the more she felt something was about to explode. Fate struck at the most unpredictable moment. A dinner. A simple occasion, at a well-known restaurant, where Ethan decided, for the last time, to try something. He dressed carefully, chose her favorite wine, and reserved the table they knew had the best view. When she arrived, something seemed different. She was more dressed up than usual. The dress, the perfume, the look in her eyes. Ethan noticed but didn't comment. They sat down, ordered dinner, and toasted. The conversation was light but superficial. He tried to bring up past topics, reminisce about stories, old smiles. She responded but didn't delve deeper. Until, halfway through dinner, a man approached the table. It was him. The other one. He hadn't been announced, nor expected. He simply arrived, as if certain he belonged there. He looked at Helena, then at Ethan. Time stood still. Ethan stood, confused, trying to understand. He asked what was happening. The answer came directly, devastatingly. The man said she was leaving with him. That they'd been together for some time. Ethan looked at Helena, expecting denial. But she said nothing. And the silence confirmed everything. The ground disappeared beneath his feet. There were no screams, no scandals. Just a man being ripped from his own life right there, in the middle of a dinner planned for reconciliation. She stood up hesitantly and left with the other man. Ethan stood there, alone, facing still warm dishes and a half-empty bottle. The restaurant, once a symbol of happy memories, was now the scene of his unraveling. He paid the bill, walked to his car, but couldn't bring himself to drive. He sat, hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on nothing. Confused thoughts, torn feelings. The pain was so great that he didn't even know where to begin. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of a story he believed was unshakable. Days later, he packed his things and left town. He didn't leave a note, didn't ask for explanations. He needed to get away. He needed to find himself again. And so he did. In a new city, with a new atmosphere, he started from scratch. And little by little, the pain gave way to rebuilding. He met a new woman with whom he exchanged sincere glances and meaningful conversations. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting. And when he finally felt free, light, and healed, the past knocked on his door. She returned. The woman who was gone now wanted to return. But Ethan was no longer the same. And in that unexpected reunion, filled with memories, tears, and silence, something even deeper would surface. Because there was an unsaid detail. A buried secret she never imagined. A detail that would change everything she thought she knew. The knock on the door that night wasn't unexpected, but Ethan took a few seconds to answer. On the other side, Helena waited with a haggard look, her hands clasped together as if unsure of where to put them. She was thinner, paler, her features marked by sleepless nights and prolonged silences. He said nothing, simply stepped aside to let her in. The house was new, the atmosphere different, but for her, everything seemed charged with memories that weren't hers. She looked around with a mixture of astonishment and sadness, as if realizing there was no longer room for her. Ethan simply watched, unhurried, unangry, but with a calm that hurt more than any scream. She began to speak hesitantly, her words stumbling over each other, saying she was sorry, that she regretted it, that it had all been a mistake, that she'd lost herself in an impulse, in a void. That she couldn't sleep, that she couldn't move on, that she still loved him, that she wanted another chance. Ethan remained silent, looking at her like someone looking at an old portrait, one that no longer matches the new decor. He simply said that it was too late. That he had rebuilt his life, that there was someone by his side who made him feel good, who loved him without hurting him. Helena asked him not to say that she was there precisely because she wanted to do things differently, to fix things. He then took a deep breath, went to a drawer, and took out a small wooden box, with signs of age around the edges. He handed it to her without saying a word. She recognized it. It was an old box, one that used to hold mementos of the couple, photos, movie tickets, little letters exchanged on special occasions. But what she found there wasn't what she expected. Inside was just one letter. A single, yellowed page, handwritten by Ethan in a firm but emotional hand. As she read it, her eyes filled with tears before she even finished the first line. Because that letter wasn't just any letter. It was a letter written by Ethan years ago, kept secret, never delivered, as if it were a contingency plan for the worst-case scenario. Helena sat, unable to say anything, and read in silence. The letter began with a sentence that was already a blow: "If you're reading this, it's because something inside us has died, and perhaps there's no going back." He said he'd always known, even without proof, that the day might come when she wouldn't choose him anymore. That she, with her intense world, might seek elsewhere what he could no longer offer. And that even if that happened, he would still love her, but he couldn't bear to live with someone who saw him as a shadow. He spoke of their love with pain, but with lucidity. About how he'd tried, to the limit of his dignity. And at the end, there was a paragraph that took Helena's breath away. He revealed that, one day in the past, he'd stumbled upon a letter from her, written but unsent, in which she declared that she no longer loved him, but still didn't know how to leave him. That she felt bound to him by gratitude, by memory, by guilt. Ethan said he read the letter, kept it, and never said anything, because he understood that love can't be begged for. And it was from that moment on that he began to prepare himself, emotionally, for the end. The letter ended with a line Helena would never forget: "When you choose to leave, I'll be ready. But when you want to come back, it might already be too late." She dropped the letter into her lap, her eyes brimming with pain, her face in her hands, murmuring that she didn't know he knew, that she never wanted him to know, that it was a letter written in a moment of confusion, that it meant nothing. Ethan responded calmly, that she had every right to feel the way she did, but that by hiding it, by choosing to quietly leave his life, she had killed any chance of a new beginning. And then came the final blow. Ethan said that after she left, he searched the entire house, trying to understand what had happened, what might have escaped him. And that was when he found the letter hidden, tucked among the books she always said she loved. And that same night, his heart in pieces, he took all their keepsakes and put them in the same box. And that he decided he would never touch any of it again, unless she came back. But not to get back together. Only to realize it was too late. Helena stood up, staggering, trying to grasp any trace of the man who had loved her. But everything about him was distant now. His gaze, his gestures, even his silence. She begged for another chance, saying that people make mistakes, that true love forgives. Ethan replied that yes, true love forgives. And for that very reason, he had already forgiven. But forgiving didn't mean taking her back. Forgiving, he said, was the ultimate act of love. It was freeing her from guilt, and himself from pain. Helena cried, sobbed, knelt at his feet, begging him not to throw everything away. He then helped her up, took her hands, and said, "You lost me the day you thought I would never leave." She hugged him tightly, and he hugged her back, but it was a goodbye hug. After that, he opened the door. She walked out slowly, stopping on the sidewalk, unsure of where to go. When she looked back, he had already closed the door. And for the first time, she understood what it was like to lose someone alive. And then, as she walked alone down the dark street, a detail from the letter came back to her with overwhelming force. The part where he said he'd found her letter among the books. But Helena remembered exactly where she'd left it. And it wasn't there. Not in that book. And it was in that moment that everything made sense. Ethan had known about the betrayal before she'd even admitted it. He'd read the letter before, understood everything, and yet, he'd made dinner. Still, he smiled. Still, he looked at her tenderly. Because, deep down, he'd already accepted the end. What she'd experienced as a discovery was already in the past for him. And that destroyed her more than any rejection. Because his forgiveness was real. But it was cold. It was the kind of forgiveness that seals a door forever. And there was more. Something she didn't know yet. Something he hadn't told her yet. Something written between the lines of everything he'd done since then. Something that would reveal that the greatest pain in this story was yet to come. That night, after the door closed and Helena disappeared into the darkness, Ethan stood in the middle of the living room for a few minutes, his body still and his thoughts a silent whirlwind. The yellow light from the lamp reflected off the discreet frames of the bookcase, filling the room with a strange tranquility. There was no anger, no revenge, just a silence he had learned to respect. He picked up the box again and put it back in the drawer. He locked it. Then he turned out the lights, went upstairs, and lay down next to the woman he now shared his days with. She slept with her face turned toward him, her lips parted, as if in a light dream. He ran his hand lightly through her hair and closed his eyes. The past had knocked on the door. And left. But part of him was still raw. On the other side of the city, Helena wandered aimlessly. He didn't take a taxi, didn't call anyone. He walked the streets as if searching for answers that were no longer there. His steps felt heavy, as if each movement carried with it all the wrong choices he'd made. He entered a bar that was still open, ordered a strong coffee, and sat by the window. He watched the cars pass, the people going about their lives. And there, between the steam from the cup and the chill that was beginning to touch her shoulders, she understood clearly what she'd previously denied: there was no way back. Everything she'd done, the neglected love, the betrayal, the cowardice of leaving without saying anything, had built an abyss. And in that abyss, now, there was only an echo. He still loved Ethan. But it was too late. He wasn't the same anymore. And maybe, if she were honest with you, neither was she. 2 days passed. Helena couldn't return to the apartment where she lived with her lover. He had moved too. After weeks of promising stability, saying he'd wait for her to sort her life out, he began disappearing. First, short messages. Then, curt replies. And then, completely gone. He didn't answer, he didn't show up. When she went to his building, an indifferent doorman informed her that he had moved out a few days ago. No warning, no trace. It was as if he'd never existed. And there, in the middle of the sidewalk, breathing heavily and eyes full of rage, Helena felt the true weight of abandonment. It wasn't just Ethan she'd lost. It was everything. She had given up what she had without guaranteeing what would come. And now she had nothing. With nowhere to go, she returned to her mother's old house. She wasn't greeted with hostility, but neither was she greeted with affection. Her mother, a woman of few words, simply opened the door and said the room was as she'd left it. Helena climbed the stairs slowly, passing through the hallways she'd known since childhood, and entered the room that now seemed too small for her mistakes. She lay for hours, staring at the ceiling, remembering every detail, every choice. And that's when she remembered the letter. Not Ethan's. But her own. The one he'd mentioned finding among the books. He stood up suddenly and began rummaging through the drawers and boxes he'd brought back. He found an old notebook, and inside it, carefully folded, was a copy of the original letter. He read it. It was as if someone else had written it. The words were raw, bitter, desperate. And there was the answer I'd been searching for. She'd never left that letter in the book. She'd kept it with her. Ethan hadn't found it by chance. It had never fallen to the floor. It had never been forgotten. He had read it because he had looked for it. And that changed everything. The next morning, Helena returned to Ethan's house. Not to beg for a second chance, but to understand. She rang the doorbell. The woman now standing next to Ethan answered. She looked at Helena calmly, without aggression. Helena asked to speak with him. She was invited to wait in the garden. He sat on a stone bench, where newly planted flowers were beginning to bloom. A few minutes later, Ethan appeared. He was calm but attentive. She stood and got straight to the point. She said she knew he had read the letter. She said she had discovered he could only have accessed it if he had gone through her things. Ethan didn't deny it. He said yes. That one Sunday when she was out, he had felt something strange and decided to look. That he wasn't looking for proof, but for peace. And that, upon finding the letter, he felt everything collapse. Helena asked why he never said anything. Why he pretended he didn't know. He took a deep breath, looked at his hands, then back at her. He said he knew that if he confronted her, she would deny it. That she might create another story, might walk away without ever explaining. And he didn't want any more explanations. He wanted to understand what she felt. And that's why he kept the letter. To read, reread, cry in silence, digest. And when she left, he was already prepared. Not to forgive her then and there, but to survive without her. Helena felt a wave of shame. She said she didn't know what to do with this truth. That she felt naked before him. He replied that she had been naked for a long time. That only now could she see herself. She then told him about the breakup with the other man. About the abandonment. About the emptiness. Not as an attempt to victimize herself, but as a confession. Ethan listened, but without any expression of pleasure or revenge. He just listened. When she finished, he said he was sorry. Not because she'd been left, but because she'd learned the hard way. He said no one deserves to be used. But that nothing is built on destruction either. She asked if he was happy now. He said yes. That it wasn't the same naive happiness as before, but it was real. That he'd found someone who looked at him with clear eyes. And most importantly, he'd learned to look at himself with more compassion. Helena lowered her head. She said she admired that. And, with a choked voice, she asked him to let her do one last thing. She asked them to return together to the restaurant where everything had happened. That she wanted to end that cycle. Ethan hesitated, but agreed. The next night, they went together. The same place, the same table. They sat, ordered wine. They spoke little. But their eyes spoke volumes. When they finished, she took a small box from her pocket. Inside was a silver ring Ethan had given her years ago. She placed it on the table and said she wanted him to have it. As a reminder of the good things. And as a symbol that she had understood everything. Ethan didn't take the ring. He said that symbol was no longer his. That it belonged to what they had been. And that, as much as they had loved each other deeply, they now needed to leave that in the past. Helena smiled. A sad but sincere smile. And in that gesture, there was peace. Outside, the sky was clear. They walked together to the corner. There, they said goodbye with a long, lingering hug. Then, each of them walked down a sidewalk. No guilt, no hatred, no promises. Just the certainty that, no matter how some stories end, it doesn't mean they weren't real. Helena returned to her mother's house. She slept soundly. Ethan returned to his home, where the woman he now shared his days with was waiting for him with a light smile. He went in, hugged her from behind, and whispered that everything was okay. She didn't ask anything. She just squeezed his hand. And in that silence, there was everything he needed. But even so, that early morning, while everyone slept, Helena got up and went to the balcony. He looked up at the sky and, for the first time in years, cried, not out of regret, but out of liberation. Because understanding that you'd lost the love of your life was an immense weight. But accepting that you could never get him back, that, finally, was freedom. The next morning, the sun filtered through the curtains with a strange softness, as if the world had fallen silent so his thoughts could gather their thoughts. Ethan woke unhurriedly, his mind still immersed in the sensations of the previous night. It wasn't easy to translate everything that had happened, everything that had been said, but there was an unusual calm in his gestures. The reunion with Helena, painful as it was, had made it clear that life doesn't go backward to satisfy belated regrets. It was like a bridge that collapses after the crossing, what was left behind exists only as a memory. He no longer felt anger, nor any desire to retaliate. Only a serene firmness, as if knowing that the choices he had made, however difficult, were the only ones possible. The woman who now shared his days woke beside him with the lightness of someone who didn't burden him with ghosts from the past, and that in itself was more than he could have asked for. Meanwhile, Helena stared at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, as if every stain on the walls said something she didn't want to hear. Her mother, always discreet, left coffee ready every day without asking. The silence between them was polite, but charged with meaning. The woman who once left home full of certainties now seemed smaller, enveloped in reflections that not even the books of her youth could convey. As mature and honest as her conversation with Ethan had been, it still weighed on her that it had taken so long to understand. What hurt most wasn't losing the man she loved. It was realizing that, deep down, she herself had contributed to her own downfall. There were no absolute villains, just poor choices, unspoken words, unfaced emptiness. And now, even surrounded by memories, she felt that loneliness was a just consequence. Not a punishment, but a learning experience. That afternoon, she went out alone to the park where she used to walk before the wedding. The seats were still there, but the faces around her were all new. He sat near an ancient tree, his hands on his knees, his gaze lost in the branches. For a moment, he thought about how everything could have been different. But he didn't allow himself to fantasize. It was useless. The pain he felt now was no longer of loss, but of awareness. There was a stark difference between regretting having been discovered and regretting finally understanding. And Helena understood that only now could she see the value of everything she had before because she had spent too much time trying to find outside what already existed within. The betrayal hadn't been against Ethan alone. It had been against herself, against the values she had once believed she defended. While she was lost in these thoughts, Ethan was returning home after a day of work. He walked silently to the garden, where the woman who was now part of his life was tending the flowers. She saw him coming and smiled slightly, but didn't ask anything. She knew he carried layers that only he could rearrange. He approached, picked up a small shovel, and began to move the soil beside her. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. There, between the newly planted roots and the naturally divided silences, he realized that love, when true, doesn't shout. It grows. And it grows where there's space. It didn't need grandiose declarations. All it took was a light touch on the shoulder, a hot cup of tea at the right time, the silent support on cloudy days. Ethan felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And for the first time in a long time, there was no conflict within him. That same week, she received a letter. Handwritten, in familiar handwriting. It was from Helena. But unlike the words she had spoken on their last visit, there was something different here. It was no longer a request, nor a plea. It was a story. She told him about the old letter he had found, about the man who had abandoned her, about the emptiness that consumed her. But above all, she spoke of the courage that was now beginning to blossom. She said she had not written to try to return, but to thank him. To thank him for being, amidst mistakes and distances, the most upright man she had ever known. And that, even without realizing it, he had planted in her a value that was only now germinating. She said she intended to leave the city. To start over. Alone. Not to forget, but to rebuild herself with dignity. Ethan read the letter in silence. He folded it carefully and put it in a drawer where now lived only the records that deserved to remain. Time marched on with its relentless logic. Helena said goodbye to her mother with a long hug and a restrained smile. She said she had to leave, and her mother simply nodded, as if she understood without having to agree. She took a bus to a small town, where she had landed a job as a coordinator at a community school. The place was simple but welcoming. She rented a modest apartment and began frequenting local bookstores, talking to strangers, rediscovering the joy of small things. There were days when she cried, yes. But she cried for understanding. And that was already progress. She knew she would never get Ethan back, and she hadn't expected it. Her biggest challenge now was to become someone he could admire from afar, even if they never exchanged a word again. Ethan, for his part, continued in harmony with his new companion. They began planning a short trip, something intimate, without ostentation. She wanted to visit a mountain village, and he thought it was the perfect idea. The landscape, she said, reminded him a little of the places he'd described in his dreams when he was young. They were getting to know each other more and more, not hurriedly, but with the calm of someone in no rush to arrive. And with each new detail revealed, he realized that love doesn't need to be redemptive to be true. It just needs to be light. Sometimes, on the nights she fell asleep first, he'd stare at the ceiling for a few minutes. He no longer thought of Helena with pain. He thought with a kind of mature longing, the kind that doesn't demand anything in return. He'd understood that love wasn't enough to keep someone. Both had to choose, every day, to stay. And when only one insists, love becomes effort, and constant effort becomes exhaustion. Months later, Helena received an unexpected message from a former colleague at the school where she taught. It was a simple question: could she write a text for a collection about new beginnings? She accepted. She wrote about roots that detach themselves from the soil, about losses that are necessary for one to find their bearings. She didn't mention names or dates. But in every line was the essence of what she had experienced. In the end, she submitted the text for publication and went about her day with a slight smile. She knew that, perhaps, someone, somewhere would read it and find a spark of understanding. And that was enough. At Ethan's house, the new garden was flourishing. Plants spread across the flower beds with an almost symbolic vitality. He spent his mornings watering, and sometimes he picked small flowers to leave on the breakfast table. His partner said that this gesture was what she admired most about him, his ability to care. But now, unlike before, he knew he could only care for others after learning to care for himself. And there, amidst the daily rituals, the backyard lunches, and the smiles exchanged for no reason, he realized that love doesn't need drama to exist. It only needs presence, listening, and truth. In another city, while browsing a craft fair, Helena stopped in front of a booth selling antiques. Among them was a frame with a handwritten quote. She read it and felt a lump in her throat. The phrase said, "Some losses are not punishment, they are liberation disguised as pain." She bought the frame and took it home. She placed it on her bookshelf, next to a new book collection she was beginning to build. She didn't know what the future held, but now she was ready to face it head-on. The choices they made had forged different paths. But now, without resentment, without lingering guilt, the reunion that once seemed impossible happened. Not to rekindle an old story, but to end a cycle that still lingered due to a lack of courage. And now, with feelings finally named, with truths revealed and accepted, all that was left was to move on. And in this moving on, both discovered that true maturity doesn't come when the other returns asking for forgiveness. It comes when we choose, with clarity, not to return. Because understanding your own worth is the first step to truly loving someone. And when you understand this, the past ceases to be a prison and becomes simply what it always was, a lesson. The days passed like steady waves, without much fanfare, but carrying with them the slow erosion of everything that had once been pain. Ethan began to surrender more deeply to his new relationship, not as someone replacing, but as someone choosing. The bond with the woman at his side was no longer just an attempt to rebuild himself, but a genuine coexistence where the past no longer needed to be denied, only understood. Together, they began to build small traditions, coffees on Sundays in a bakery hidden behind the square, silent walks on Friday afternoons, and sometimes simply the comfort of cooking together while music filled the air. The complicity between them wasn't imposed, but rather arose from respect and mature affection. She no longer asked about what he had experienced before her, not out of disinterest, but because she knew the answers lay in the way he looked at her now. But even true serenity is visited by the past from time to time. One afternoon, during a chance meeting with former colleagues, Ethan learned that Helena had published a text in a local literary anthology. A former colleague, unaware of the details of their story, commented that the text had touched many people and that Helena now led writing workshops with socially vulnerable youth. At first, Ethan just smiled, wishing her well. But when he got home, he sat down at his computer and searched for the publication. He found it. The title was discreet, but the first line already made his chest tighten: "Losing yourself can be the first step to finding yourself again." He read the text carefully. There were no names, no direct references, but he recognized the story told there. And for the first time, he was able to read it all without pain. Only with the full understanding that love had already served its purpose. And that her path needed to follow, too. That same night, beside the woman he loved, Ethan shared the text. He read it aloud, and when he finished, she looked him in the eye and asked if he wanted to write back. Not to her, but to himself. Ethan thought for a few seconds, then replied no. That everything that needed to be said had already been said that night, at that table, with that final embrace. What he needed now was just to live. The woman smiled, held his hand, and said she understood. They remained there, sitting on the sofa, sharing the calm breath of those who know that their current love is not a continuation of a patched-up past, but rather a new story written with letters that carry no remains. Meanwhile, Helena began to allow herself small celebrations. The writing workshops became more than just work. There, among teenagers who carried stories of abandonment, hunger, and silence, she found meaning again. It wasn't about you anymore, it was about giving back. Giving back care, presence, listening. One morning, one of the boys handed her a note with crooked writing: "You taught me that pain isn't shameful, it's just a reminder that we need help." She held the paper like someone receiving a prize. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could be part of someone's healing. And this, as simple as it was the first page of a new chapter she herself was beginning to write. Still, there were difficult days. Dates that brought back memories without permission. Like their wedding anniversary, which she tried to ignore, but which she ended up marking with a silent visit to the beach where they had spent their honeymoon. She sat alone in the sand, her feet touching the foam, and there she spoke quietly words she had never had the courage to say. Not to apologize, but to release. She said she still remembered the smell of mornings beside him, the way he frowned when he read something important, the way he touched her waist without fanfare as they passed through a crowd. She said she still loved him, but that it was now a feeling without an address. And that everything was okay. She cried, but it was a serene cry, like someone finally accepting that not all love needs to last to be true. On the way home, she passed a woman selling handmade necklaces on the side of the road. There was a model made with white stones and a metal pendant shaped like a feather. The woman said that feathers represented lightness after heaviness. Helena smiled, bought it, and put it around her neck. It was a new symbol, a silent promise that she would no longer live with the same burden as before. The days that followed were gentler. She began to write more frequently, no longer about loss, but about unexpected encounters. She wrote about women rebuilding themselves, men learning to love without control, young people who, despite their scars, still believed in tenderness. And in each character, there was a little of her, a little of him, a little of what they had experienced and what they now chose to leave behind. On the other side, Ethan was starting a new professional project that involved bringing environmental education to isolated communities. He traveled frequently, experiencing new realities, but always returned home with the same enthusiasm. His partner, now more present in his routine, began accompanying him on some trips. They shared experiences and learned together. On one of these trips, during a community event, they met a young writer who had been Helena's student. He mentioned, unaware of the connection, that his teacher had changed his life. Ethan listened, smiled, and for the first time, felt a kind of quiet pride. She was no longer just a painful memory. She was now part of a larger story, a woman who had faced her own shadows to shine a light in others. One night, back in the city, Ethan received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a small booklet with a light blue cover, titled, "For Those Who Chose to Continue." It was the collection in which Helena's text had been published. There was a simple dedication, "Thank you for everything you didn't say. It was in the silence that I listened most." He held the book for a few minutes before putting it back on the shelf. There was no need to reopen wounds. But it wasn't a wound. It was now a mark. And marks are only signs of where we've been, not chains that bind us. That night, he and his partner had dinner in the backyard, under a clear, silent sky. No urgency, no explanations. Just there, two whole bodies who chose to love each other lightly. Helena, in her new routine, woke up every day before sunrise. She sat with a cup of tea in front of the window and wrote for half an hour. It was a commitment to herself. She had started writing a novel. She didn't know if it would be published, but she wanted to tell a story about late choices and silent redemptions. There was a character inspired by Ethan, but it wasn't a copy. It was an idealized version, perhaps. A reflection of what she believed he had become. And that made her smile. Because even if they never met again, even if they never exchanged a word again, she knew that a part of him would live forever in her writing, not as a memory of pain, but as the foundation of what she finally understood as love. Both of them were now at peace. And peace, she had learned, is not the absence of pain. It is the full acceptance of what was. Of what could have been. And of what might yet be. Nothing was the same, but everything made sense. And that, finally, was all they needed to move on. Because some stories don't need to end happily. They need to end truthfully. And this, finally, was their truth. Months later, the paths that had once intertwined so intensely no longer crossed, not even in their thoughts. Time, with its merciless ability to rearrange what seemed definitive, had placed each person exactly where they needed to be. Ethan now lived with the tranquility of someone who no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to justify his choices, he didn't need to erase the past, nor did he need the acknowledgement of those who had hurt him. He had built a new home where trust was the foundation, no longer a fragile expectation, and where love manifested itself not in eternal promises, but in constant gestures of care and respect. Gradually, his life became simpler and richer, marked not by grand declarations, but by a routine that restored his dignity. The days continued to be full of meaning. He worked, wrote, traveled when he could, and always returned home with a light heart. There were no longer invisible weights on his shoulders, no longer were doubts gnawing at his heart. Only the peace that comes from the certainty that you did everything possible, and when you couldn't anymore, you had the courage to let go. The woman who now walked beside him had become his companion in the purest sense of the word. She didn't question him about what he'd experienced before, not out of disinterest, but out of wisdom. She understood that those who have survived profound pain carry wounds that need not explanation, but space. She loved all of Ethan, including his scars, including the silences that sometimes overtook him. And this made him love her with a gratitude he'd never felt before. Not because she came to fill a void, but because she came after he'd learned to fulfill himself. Their relationship wasn't the kind that impressed with appearances, but one that withstood time, doubts, and fears. The kind of love that blossoms when we learn that being loved isn't about being idolized, but about being accepted even with our most naked imperfections. On the other side, Helena continued her journey without fanfare, but also without further escape. The woman who had once left everything behind for an unresolved passion now understood the difference between desire and love. And more than that, she understood the difference between selfish regret and emotional responsibility. In her new city, she had managed not only to build a routine but also to reconnect with aspects of herself that had been dormant for years. The teacher who had previously taught theoretically now taught with experience. The young people she worked with looked to her not for perfection, but for authenticity. And this made her feel useful again. The workshops she led became spaces of collective healing, and there, between pencils and paper, she found herself again. She hadn't returned to romantic relationships. Not out of fear, but because she was still in a process of internal reconstruction that required space. For the first time, she was learning to live with herself. Loneliness was no longer a punishment, it was a choice. And with this choice, she learned every day to restore her self-esteem not through external validation, but through intimate achievements. But the universe sometimes likes to test our emotional fortitude. On a cold autumn evening, there was a regional literature conference in a nearby town, and both Helena and Ethan had been invited as speakers. She for her work with young writers, he for his educational project. Neither knew of the other's participation. When Helena arrived and saw his name on the program, her heart stopped for a second. But she didn't run away. She sat in the audience. When Ethan entered, he saw her among the guests. There was no surprise, just a quick glance of recognition. He spoke with the same lightness he had acquired recently. He spoke about new beginnings, about active listening, about the power of words when used honestly. Helena listened to every word, not as someone expecting something, but as someone who understands that certain connections don't dissolve, only transform. At the end, they exchanged a brief wave, almost imperceptible to those unfamiliar with the story. They didn't speak. And they didn't need to. That moment was the silent and definitive farewell to a story that had already served its purpose. On the way home, Helena found herself smiling as she remembered the talk. There was no resentment, no desire. There was only immense respect for that man who, even after everything, carried no bitterness. And in that respect, she also found a little more respect for herself. Ethan, upon arriving home, hugged his partner more tightly. He told her he'd rediscovered a part of his past, but that everything was at peace. She didn't ask anything else. And that was enough. Time passed a little more. Ethan and his partner decided to formalize their union in a discreet way. An intimate wedding, among close friends, without pomp, but full of meaning. In his speech, he spoke not about the past, but about the present. He said that true love is not the kind that never fails, but the kind that learns to recognize its flaws and still chooses to stay. Helena learned about the ceremony through a mutual friend. Instead of pain, she felt pride. She wrote a letter she would never send, wishing him all the happiness possible. She kept it in a notebook, and there, she sealed the last page of a story that was finally coming to an end within her. Years later, when she released her first solo book, Helena received a letter from a reader who said he had been deeply impacted by one of the characters. The reader said her story helped him understand that there is life even after destroying what he loves. And that the most important thing was to have the courage to rebuild. Helena cried when she read those words. Because there, in that text sent by a stranger, was confirmation that her pain was not in vain. She had transformed her failure into strength, her fall into momentum, her loss into a legacy. And that, for her, was more than enough. Ethan, now more mature, began teaching sporadic classes on human relationships and emotional ethics. In one of his classes, he was asked if he believed love could withstand betrayal. He thought for a few seconds and responded calmly. He said that love can withstand almost anything, but that trust is like the soil in a garden. If poisoned, no matter how many seeds remain, nothing healthy will grow. And that sometimes, love also means knowing how to let go. And so this story ended. A story where no one emerged unscathed, but everyone emerged transformed. A story where betrayal destroyed, yes. But not forever. Because although betrayed love never returns, it can leave a lesson so profound that it forces us to grow. Ethan moved on, found a more mature, more whole love, and understood that what is truly given is not lost. You only lose what is not valued. Helena, in turn, learned that the consequences of betrayal don't end with the end of a relationship. They reverberate in the soul. But if faced truthfully, they can also become the bridge to a life more honest with oneself. If you've made it this far, you were certainly touched by this story. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think? Leave your comment below. Your opinion is very important to us. And of course, if you liked this story and want to hear many others with lessons as impactful as this one, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share it with anyone who needs to reflect on love and the choices we make. And remember, betrayal may seem like a temporary solution to an emotional problem, but it erodes the foundation of everything you've built with care. It destroys homes, breaks bonds, and destroys respect. It's not worth it. Trust, once broken, can be forgiven, but it will never be the same. Value those by your side. Honor the love you receive. Because when you lose someone who truly loved you, it may be too late to get back. This channel does not, under any circumstances, support any type of infidelity. Our commitment is to show, through fiction, the real and devastating effects that infidelity can cause. Until the next story.